Hello, Jeando.
Hello, Kevin.
Last two videos we've been talking about how to regulate emotions and how feelings affecting the work and what should be done about our feelings, if anything, or how we should deal with them. And F.M. Alexander in his books, he talks about restraint and suppression as in some parts of his books. And this seems to contradict something that's more popular nowadays, which would be, you're meant to express your emotions and let everything out and be spontaneous and these type of things. So it's not very fashionable to talk about restraining and suppressing things. So can you talk a little bit about what Alexander means by that, and then how you use this in a lesson?
Okay, yes, the subject is fantastic. I don't think I can do what you want me to do, which is saying you said talk a little bit. I don't think that is possible. The subject is way too vast, so I am not even sure I can express it in one session to finish, to wrap up what we've already said about that questioning. And but yes, I absolutely want to continue on the subject. This is, by the way, part of the general discussion about what is this development of activity. I consider that we are still giving lessons for people to learn to do things, and this was part of that, subpart of conscious guidance and control. And yes, the question of restraint and suppression, these are words coming from Alexander's books. Well, not only, of course, Alexander is discussing these questions that were very, very at the front in the 1930s. In the 1930s, there was this educational surge where people wanted to get free of restraint, or have children got free of restraints. They thought that the old Victorian way of teaching, do this and shut up, was incorrect, and so they started some free schools and the free system where people were to express themselves, express their inner self, all these kind of questions that, of course, Alexander contradicted very strongly. And so we need to understand how this relates to what we recently discussed, the case of that student who said that she was getting the grip of directing a series of movements of the parts of her organism. And I approve because this fact is controlled by different videos, video recording of a reaction to a series of orders and directions of inhibition of movements and orders of definite performance of movements she received in a conscious guidance procedure in a lesson. So that was the nice part. But she added that she had no such success in directing her mind when besieged with emotional thoughts. That's the question she asked. What does it really mean to become able to guide ourselves constructively and consciously without suppressing reactions? I'm interested in rebounding on suppressing reactions. It's a subject that Alexander was interested into, and so he's written a long chapter, and a few paragraphs I've taken out, and I want to discuss these. But before, it's necessary to situate that reasoning. When we say how to get better organized in our heads and our emotional life, I made clear in my second answer, which is our second talk relative to this question, the talk just before this one, that I stress that we are not at least avoiding suppression or restraint. The definition of suppression is to, that's from the dictionary. It says to forcefully stop an action. There is also to prevent and stop oneself from showing emotion and consciously resist having a thought or feeling Well, this is part of psychoanalysis perspective. And so what I said is that we are not afraid of the first part, and we are not interested in the second. I have no say about the third. So to stop actions is absolutely central to the Alexander technique, or to Alexander thinking, is that there are many actions that we do that we should not, and that we should very clearly see coming and anticipate and prevent from happening. That is clearly to forcefully stop an action. So this is what Alexander is saying. To get better organized in our head, there are categories that we need to have. We need to be able to think. And so, for example, restraint is not a foul word for us. Restraint is absolutely necessary for having freedom. And so I've taken a little quote from Man's Supreme Inheritance, where Alexander says, so that we know. So apparently we are not so sure that we know, or my pupil was not so sure that she knew that we cannot have freedom without restraint, anymore that we can have psychophysical harmony without antagonism. This is, you will see, the point of the broad mental attitude. We have to be capable of balancing opposite, freedom, restraint, harmony, antagonism. These are obviously opposites, and it's necessary to be able to think them. It's obvious that if you have something emotional about these words, it's going to be difficult to have this broad reasoning attitude. You're going to be focused on something, or focused on avoiding something, and not letting your reasoning roam freely. So to get better organized in your head, as my student puts it, we have to, really see what we mean by suppression. What is it that is a suppression? For Alexander, it may be very different than from most of modern people would define the words. So look at this quote. Again, Man's Supreme Inheritance. I'm showing the quote, and I'm going to tell you about it. So in the second edition, that's the 1918 edition, be careful, it's page 81. So what Alexander is saying is, I'm going to read, let us suppose that a person decides that he will take lessons in re-education from a certain teacher and comes to the first lesson. The teacher proceeds to indicate to the pupil, firstly, the result of his diagnosis of the pupil psychophysical peculiarities, delusions, and defects, which he proposes to attempt to eradicate. And secondly, the means whereby this eradication is to be effected. Well, there is one thing I want to stress, is that when F.M. Alexander writes that he attempts to eradicate delusions and defects, or when we are not very sure if he declares that he attempts, or the pupil attempts to eradicate the delusions and defects, you must realize that the only person in a position to eradicate a habit is the pupil, and certainly not the teacher. The teacher position is there to indicate the means whereby the eradication is to be effected, and is to provide experiences where the pupil can practice the new adjustment leading to a better balance. He needs to, in fact, create conditions where the pupil can start responding in a broad reasoning attitude. This is not given. It's not because you just point out peculiarities or defects that these peculiarity of defects and defects are going to be, first of all, recognized by the pupil, then eradicated, then suppressed. The teacher has to be there to give to the pupil the reasoning necessary or the means whereby the eradication is to be effected. So this is all very theoretical, and I wanted to relate this student testimony with a very interesting story that I gathered in lessons with me, so that you could get something a bit clearer about what it is, what are we discussing here, what is the psychophysical peculiarities, delusions and defects that the teacher is diagnosing. Wow, how is this happening during a lesson? And secondly, what are we discussing? The means whereby the eradication is to be effected. There are means whereby for the suppression, meaning that we are going to see that very often the pupil is at first in no position to eradicate or suppress the defects by herself. If you look at the situation, the pupil is expressing what is happening to her. Well, she maybe fears suppression, but for the moment, the difficulty she's facing is that she cannot suppress the thinking associated with negative emotion that are coming back all the time. The emotions are there to stay, she says. That means that she's oppressed by something, and it's obvious that she has no means of suppressing these unwanted thoughts. So at the moment we want to put a bad label onto suppression, but at the same time it would be very nice if the pupil could suddenly be capable of simply suppressing these unwanted thoughts. So here is the thing. This is more the end. We have a student that is, in fact, you will see in a procedure, and she's requested to perform some movements and to suppress, inhibit other movements. So this is the wall exercise, the procedure described by Fem Alexander in 1907. Yeah. So with the pupil, we noted that each time she was requested to fall backwards toward the wall. So the wall is 6 inches or less than 6 inches away from her heels. So she was not injured during these experiments. It's absolutely reasonable to be asked to fall backwards when there is a wall that is just 5 inches behind her. But when she was, responding to the orders, we noted that each time, at the moment of falling backwards, or even just before really falling back, she had difficulty allowing herself to fall backwards. We noticed that she was forcefully lifting the toes up off the floor. And obviously that was in reaction to the feeling of falling backward. She had accepted, she reasoned out that it was safe to fall in that way, but still she could not, or she did not at first make any sort of attempt without lifting the toes off the floor. So I asked her some restraint. I asked her to suppress this reaction, suppress it so that it would not be seen on film. On these images, you see that she's fallen, and on these images, this is the end of the session. She's falling without the toes lifting off the floor. But you must understand that it took some time to achieve this simple suppression of the movement of the front of the foot off the floor. One thing is that the procedure is such that she knew the reaction was going to take place each time she would feel a disequilibrium backward. she knew it because she did it, and many times, and we have a video recording that we watched together, and it was seen that obviously she was lifting the toes off the floor, despite the fact that I told her to stop lifting the toes off the floor. I told her that she had to suppress these movements, and because it was not reasonable to lift the toes in that way. And I explained that it would only make sense if she had, if there was what we call a sit-up bar. You see, this is a picture of a person that is performing some gymnastic, but it's interesting because that helped her understand maybe one reason of her psychophysical reaction. If you have a sit-up bar above the front of the foot, above the toes, then her movements against the concrete anchor or prop would tend to suppress, break, or slow down the movement of the torso falling backward. Well, in the procedure of the whole exercise defined by Alexander, this lifting of the toes without any sit-up bar is just evidence of an unwanted fear reaction that, of course, needed to be eradicated. It was also needed to be eradicated because I could show her that the reaction led her to shorten her back, to push the shoulders faster backward and the head backward, while the abdomen was resisting forward with the feet. So lifting the toes was not separate, isolated from the whole general condition of shortening the back and pulling the neck back. It was absolutely part of it. Yeah. And why invest so much energy, because there was energy, into lifting the toes when there is no anchor, no prop or sit-up bar to resist from. So she agreed that it would be positive to suppress that kind of reaction. But from there, everything got worse, because she found that in practice that she had no success in the task of eradication of the toes movement. And that despite knowing that she was going to do it, she was going to lift the toes every time she was asked to fall, she could not suppress the unwanted reaction. The unwanted reaction was filmed over and over again, and she knew it. Now she was in a position to feel that she was indeed lifting the front of the foot off the floor, and not only when she was with her back toward the wall. She noticed more and more during the fortnight between our lessons that she was very often out of balance, and very often this disequilibrium was associated with the front of the foot not on the floor, lifted. So, yes, as I said, she had a lesson fortnight later, and she conceded that she had no clue. She had no conception of the means whereby the eradication could be effected. And it was obvious on top that she was annoyed. She was sort of emotionally affected by the discovery of her incapacity to alter her psychophysical behavior in foreseeable circumstances. So suppression is not that easy. Restraint is not something that comes to you easily. It's there are, of course, some actions that are happening, some action you don't want, but you don't know which action they are, and so she was a bit at a loss. Yes. Her reasoning at the time was not leading her to any success. So that's where after diagnosing this peculiarity, it was the time for me to act as a teacher. We are not just here to point out peculiarities and defects. It's also necessary, as you remember what Alexander said. He said, secondly, the means whereby the eradication is to be effected have to be transmitted to the pupil. And so that's when I proceed to show her that the reaction could be formally studied. And so I came back to showing her what happens when the person is using a prop. And I started to show her that the reaction was in fact composed by two distinct rotations. I show her that when a person is using a prop, so I've got two images here, and there is a tendency you will see for, the appearance of two different rotations. One of the lower leg that is very often called the talotibial column. Talo for talus, just under the tibia we have the talus, and we have the tibial column. And on the other hand, there is also another part. So the external rotation of the talotibial column is associated with supination. The front foot is rotated externally along its long axis. So that's what you see here. These two movements were occurring, and in her case, these two movements were in evidence. And she could not refute the fact that when she lifted the toes, she was making movements with the lower leg and with the front of the foot. And these two movements were absolutely coordinated together. It was leading to the wrong reaction, but it was her coordination at that moment. While saying this, I had to have her fall and repeat the task and film it, and for her to discover that I was telling the truth. Because despite, or maybe because of her previous training with the Alexander technique, she did not realize that she was doing these movements while she was taken in her habitual reaction, which had an emotional overtone. The emotional overtone is the fear of falling. It's difficult to reason when you have a strong emotional direction of your mind, if you do not balance that with other things. So when we started to establish the means whereby the wrong reaction, I had to, in fact, allow her to slowly realize that, yes, these two movements were taking place. The somatic perception, the awareness through feeling, do not give any idea of this. She could have continued all her life to react in this way, not knowing that this way means a certain use of the parts of the mechanism of the toe, foot, ankle, leg mechanism. So in the task set by the procedure, she obviously felt she was out of balance. But that feeling tended to suppress, eradicate what she could not feel, and therefore what she could not describe, which was the definite movements that were happening in her reaction to the feeling of being out of balance. She discovered, by the way, that the wall was not necessary for her to engineer the same reaction, and discovered that, yes, very, very often she was on the outside of the feet, because as you can see, when there is an external rotation, there is too much force on the outside of the feet, more than it should have been. You can see this is not conducive to a good equilibrium. So I could show her these images, these diagrams, which indicate very clearly the coordination of the movement between the foot, the ankle, and lower leg, which corresponded to a manner of using the mechanism, leading to a lack of equilibrium and incorrect posture. And I could, not because I have keen eyes, because I had already myself received descriptions of these movements. So that's a very different point, which we make, where we make the difference between what I call, well, habitual observation. Many people, this person has received initial modern Alexander technique lesson long before having lessons with me, and casual observation is something that is promoted in the modern Alexander technique. People are asked to notice what's happening. What they notice is what they feel or the sensations that are occurring. There is something else that I call formal monitoring. And so here we are discussing formal monitoring of the movements of the different parts of the toe, foot, ankle, leg mechanism. And so I said it was somewhat easy for me to look at for the means whereby of unwanted reaction, because I had studied FM Alexander's own description for his own difficulty with undue muscle tension in the use of the leg, feet, and toes. So there is a passage in the use of the self where Alexander discovers that his problem is not in the region that he thought was responsible. His problem is not, in fact, restricted to the neck and head region. He discovered, and he said, there is an undue muscle tension in the rest of the organism. And this is associated with the vocal problem. So in no way solving the vocal sphere could sort his problem. So he says, I observed that this condition of undue muscle tension affected particularly the use of my legs, feet, and toes. This is written on the screen. That's what I am reading at the moment. My toes being contracted and bent downwards in such a way that my feet were unduly arched, my weight thrown more on the outside of my feet than it should have been, and my balance interfered with. That's the use of the self, page 11. So, when I read these passages, and if you remember, I was not just reading, I was translating these passages into French. Well, at first my reaction was dubious, you would say. I did not really understand at first what Alexander was discussing. It's only when I started to really try and find formal elements that I realized what he was talking about, and I realized that I was myself very often taken by the same manner of reaction, exactly as the student I'm talking about was, much later. So when I was studying this, suddenly I roamed the educational internet, and I found, of course, some works by McConnell, 1945, I think, and later I found one student of him called Sarafian, who has published many articles, and Sarafian is now the leader of the understanding of the biomechanics of the toe, foot, ankle, leg mechanism. And so I started to see what Alexander was describing. The feet unduly arched, comes with, of course, a cause. Most people think that the foot is unduly arched because the person is tensing the muscles. And if the feet are unduly arched, if the toes are contracted and bent downward, if the weight is thrown more on the outside of the feet, then, well, this condition comes from too excessive muscle tension. Very often, that's the reasoning. What is absolutely interesting and really hypnotized me is that McConnell and Sarafian have a very different explanation. And what is interesting is that it's not only an explanation, is that they demonstrated with a corpse that their theory was correct. They demonstrated that the outcome, which is the feet unduly arched, the weight thrown more on the outside of the feet, and the balance interfered with, is not caused by undue muscle tension. It's caused by movements, and especially the external rotation of the tibial structure above the foot create these conditions where, I should explain these conditions. There are two conditions that have been clearly described by McConnell. There is the loose back position. It's the one described by Alexander. But there is another one. It's the closed back position. And so in our way of expressing things, you could say that the loose back position is what we call a position of mechanical disadvantage, while the closed back position is what we call the position of mechanical advantage. And so we have a demonstration of two series of rotations applied simultaneously on the leg and the foot, resulting either in a position of mechanical advantage or a position of mechanical disadvantage, because these rotations are rotating an osteofibrous mass. That's how they describe the toe, foot, ankle, lower leg mechanism. A very dense, fibrous osteofibrous mean that the bones are all connected with very strong ligament, fascia, and all sorts of connective tissues that if you turn the tibia one way, you get a certain position of the foot and an absence of spring resistance. All these osteofibrous system becomes limp, becomes lax, released. And when it is released, the foot cannot act as a correct, spring support for the rest of the torso. If the spring support doesn't come from the foot, you will have to compensate. You'll have to do many muscle tensions elsewhere, and this is going to, immediately have an effect on your torso. And if it has an effect on your torso, because the spine is attached both to the pelvis and to the rib cage, it's going to have following after effect on the neck and head. So it's possible to suddenly represent what the pupil was doing. Yeah, she was constructing not a strong, stiff, spring-powered support, which makes support much easier to achieve. But she was constructing a weak, a loose and imperfect support, making equilibrium very unlikely and requiring a strong muscular effort to maintain stability. She was always subconsciously monitoring a lack of this spring-powered support, and she was not very capable on her feet. She was easily overbalanced, and she knew it. Oh, she knew it subconsciously. Yeah. So from then on, we started to discuss movements. I had her realize that it was possible to distinguish between different movements above and below the knee. It was possible to conceive an antagonism, an opposition of movement between the talotibial column, the inferior part of the knee, and the movement at the front of the foot. So you see here the difference between casual observation. I'm annoyed by the stimulus of feeling backward and the unreasoned behavior that follows it, and the formal self-monitoring. So the difference is that lies in the form of behaviors that ensue that will follow the acknowledgement. It's not just showing a person that the person is doing a series of movements that are unwanted, but it's showing also that there are two kinds. When the toes are up, the arch goes up. When the arch goes up, the plantar fascia and all the osteofibrous mass become lax, and therefore we haven't got the correct support that we need, either when falling backward or forward or when standing upright. And so I started to view with her that it's possible to, reason, to have a broad reasoning attitude where we are just discussing movements and this loose back position and the close back position. And this leads us to having to, but this is not the legs of my students, of course. You may have recognized that it's a gentleman, but it's exactly what we see here, a young gentleman, a young sportsman, and we see that his habit is not what we want. There is a O-shaped on the knee, which explained the difficulty this gentleman had with the pain in the knees that he had. And so I asked him to start rotating the talotibial tract. You see the blue arrows are indicating of what we are requesting, because what we see, and with my pupil it was the same, we saw that at first when he was rotating in the correct way, immediately you could see the outside of the inferior part of the knee moving out even more, so that the readjustment that I was asking was increasing the problem. So that is just something we need to check. How is the person going to respond to verbal orders of movements? Well, at first the person will just ask, but how am I supposed to be capable of rotating the ankle internally? And my answer is very simple. It's by understanding the problem and ordering the movement. But I don't know which muscles are acting there. You don't need to know which muscles or the name of muscles or the place of muscles. It's not the point for the moment. The point is, is it possible for you to rotate the ankle internally or not? Let's see. We don't know. Just accept any sort of feeling that comes out of it. But direct this movement. Create this movement. When we created the movement, then we started to see that there was something happening at the top. A collapse of the interior part of the superior part of the knee and a movement of the external part of the knee outwards. And so from there, we started to see that it was necessary for him to separate the movement below the knee and above the knee and get a different rotation on the superior part of the knee. Wow, at first, just the idea to have the superior part of the knee turn in one way and the inferior part of the knee turning the other way was absolutely alien to him. So we had to go through this, the translation of a theory in practice. So, these images are just showing that, it's possible. But then something else appeared, is that when he was suddenly creating the two movements together and continuing, there was a tendency for the heels to move inward. So we could see that there was a tendency for the lower ankle to move inward, but the heels would come with it. Again, we decided, well, we reasoned out that this was not what was requested, or the correct organization of the movements was to have a rotation at the superior part of the knee, a rotation at the inferior part of the knee, but we had to, well, suppress the habitual reaction to the two new movements in a way that the heels would be directed outwards again. Well, all this can be explained. There are many ways, but for example, when you look at the first reaction, which was lifting the toes off the floor, it's very, very common. All my students have more or less the same reaction, so I had time to study it very extensively. So we will see that to lift the toes, there is of course the extensor digitorum longus, the one in orange here, but that muscle will never act alone. It will act always with the tibialis anterior, which is the one that I'm interested in here, because the tibialis anterior goes under the front of the foot. And when it's activated, of course, it's supinating the foot. It's lifting the big toe off the floor. It's putting the pressure. Alexander talks about weight. The weight was more on the outside of the foot than it should have been. Here you get it. The tibialis anterior provokes that. And so we start to see that, of course, the tibialis anterior is responsible for the lifting of the interior side of the sole of the foot off the floor, but it cannot be really responsible for the rotation of the talotibial tract, the talotibial column. This consequence is coming from elsewhere. And the movement of the inferior exterior part of the knee now is clearer. Now you think, okay, when we are lifting, you must understand that there is a pull on both extremities of the tibialis anterior. When you pull the foot out, you pull from the top to the bottom, you must understand that the muscle is pulling the top toward the same direction. And this could explain now why there was such a tendency when he was correcting one movement, instead of suppressing the direction of one, he was just, in fact, repercuting the whole pull on the top. So it was necessary to react in a more, well, comprehensive way, a broadening reasoning attitude. And so he started to compile, and with my students it was a bit different. With the original student, we discovered that when she was suddenly applying movement at the superior part of the knee and the inferior part of the knee, this is the second image, there was a tendency for the torso to be really thrown out very high. And we discovered that she was compensating because when she was reorganizing the movement of the upper knee, lower knee, and of course, the front part of the foot, her pelvis had a tendency to collapse forward at the front. And of course, this is not the movement that we want to see appear. So we started to question that new reaction once again, and to say, wow, could it be possible then to reorient the movement of the superior part of the knee, of the inferior part of the knee, in order to get an internal rotation and, of course, the opposite movement at the front of the foot, so that instead of having the weight thrown on the outside of the foot, we are really getting a strong connection with the internal part of the foot. Then could it be possible to lift the front of the pelvis up? Because if it does not, if it goes down, we can see that it's shortening the spine from below. And so we had to continue this kind of work until she discovered that, wow, when she was organizing the new movements associated with the position of mechanical advantage, there was a total suppression of the lifting of the toes when she was falling backward. And she could reproduce the same suppression of a reaction as long as she had in mind the means whereby movement that were promoting a correct support from the toes upward. And so this, in fact, is necessary because otherwise, when you follow what my student was saying, it can give the impression that she was suddenly able to guide the movements of the different parts. So that was fine. But how could she organize her head and when she was in an emotional reaction? The broad reasoning attitude is not different. You must understand. You must understand that for the moment, well, she could be, it's quite fine because she's been pointed to a peculiarity associated with an emotional situation. Falling back is quite emotional for anybody. And being out of balance is, at that moment, she was starting to anticipate and to have her mind organized with very clear and definite movements, definite direction of movements, but also definite inhibition of movements. So what is important here is not that we are fighting the emotion. We are not fighting the emotion. We are acknowledging the emotion, the surprise and the fear, but we are in fact training her at the time when she's getting that emotion, at that time to be able simultaneously to have a very broad reasoning attitude in order to direct movements. So when she's obsessed by, besieged by different negative emotion, we don't want her to fight these emotions, to try and suppress consciously these emotions. No. We are just asking her to be capable of keeping a broad reasoning attitude. This is not possible just by simple decisions. You have to train yourself. And you have to go through these phases where emotions are always present. When you're asked to perform rotations at the superior part of the knee, inferior part of the knee, and ankle together, well, at first you must understand that you have no sort of, success in this. So you are always faced with this difficulty of translating things that there are restraints that are there. And you tend to react first emotionally to these restraints. I have some students, they are even sometimes shouting at me. Well, show it to me if you can do it. It's clearly an emotional response. I don't mind. I refuse to show anything. I say, I don't think it's a lesson for me. It's a lesson for you at the moment. And I understand it's not easy. You see that when you are starting to perform the correct movement somewhere, there are other movements that are appearing elsewhere. And again, I'm asking you to see whether you could, whether it's a dare game. Could it be possible to perform these movements while having in mind the definite suppression of other movements? So the difference in response to the difference in behavior is simply that instead of having one idea, one thing in mind, I don't want to feel bad, or I don't want my toes to be lifted off the floor. Well, very often when you talk about broad reasoning attitude, we are just talking numbers. How many numbers of ideas have you got at the same time? And you will discover that you can, because of this postural technique, start to associate with any situation the fact that you are physically present, that there are physical parts that have to be organized together, no matter what situation you're in. You can always broaden your mental attitude by using that tool. You bring the tool to you. You're not fighting the emotions. You're just making sure that no matter which emotion you are through, you are still agile. mentally. You're still directing yourself consciously. You're still organizing your mind. Because the question, how to get better organized in our heads? Well, you get better organized in your heads when you start to collect ideas. In English, you have this word calm and collected. Calm and collected means exactly what it does. It's like you want to collect many ideas at the same time. You don't want to be taken emotionally on something that is going to focus you and sever your connection with your reasoning. That's the start of this talk, and there are two things we are going to discuss the next time. Is that passage where Alexander, so let's have a look just a second. It's a long passage in Constructive Conscious Control of the Individual, page 118. This is a passage that was added. It's not from the second edition, it's from the third edition. Alexander made, and he said, there had just come to my knowledge an interesting objection to the importance which I attach to the process of inhibition as a primary and fundamental factor in the technique of the scheme I advocate. And the objection is made on the ground that this use of inhibition will cause harmful suppression individual concern. So it's a very long passage that I'm going to see. I've got, I don't know, 7, 8 different little excerpts of that same passage. We are going to see how Alexander is conducting his defense. It's quite different from mine, but there are similarities, of course. And with that, there is another quote that I want also to relate to the same question of suppression, is the question of the broadening our mind by a sustained effort connected with the means whereby principle. Is that Alexander is saying that ordinarily, in attempts to use two or more parts in remedial work, the primary projection ends with the correct or incorrect use of the part concerned with the primary movement. And so Alexander explained that this kind of focusing on something and expecting an end and then stopping and going on to something else is exactly the problem of the student that is overwhelmed by some repetitive ideas. And he relates directly the succession, because the projection of continued, which I call succession conscious orders, on the other hand, continuing to rotate the superior part of the knee, continuing to rotate the inferior part of the knee, continuing to rotate the ankle and the front of the foot. He says it calls for a broad reasoning attitude. You can construct a broad reasoning attitude from a postural basis. As you're present posturally everywhere you feel an emotion, then you have a way to start constructing a broad reasoning attitude and start from that vantage point, I would say, from that strong point to deal with other difficulties, like, for example, being besieged by unwanted ideas. So I'm going to discuss these two long quotes in our next episode, if you don't mind, because it's already, 1 hour now.
So for people listening, if you'll want to book a lesson with Jeando, you can find a link underneath his website and his email address, and we will see you in the next video. Thank you, Jeando.
Thank you, Kevin.